Hey everyone, Video Game Lover here, and welcome to another review. And today I'll be reviewing the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn came out in November of 1994 in Japan, November 22nd of 1994. And this was the successor to the Sega Genesis. It was going up against the Sony PlayStation, which came out 1 week after the Sega Saturn came out. Sega really wanted to get the Sega Saturn out before the PlayStation. Now, the Sega Saturn was supposed to come out September of 1995 in the US. Well, in E3, they surprised everyone and said that the Sega Saturn was coming out today in the US, which was May 11th of 1995. When that news came out, developers freaked the hell out because that didn't give them enough time to localize all their Japanese games to the North American Sega Saturn. So right out the gate, the launch was already botched. Now, the Sega Saturn was a very, very powerful system at its time. It came with a Motorola 68000 processor and a Hitachi processor, which was also in the Sega 32X. So it was a very powerful system, but it came at a price that it was very, very complicated to make for a lot of game developers. There were way too many chips. There were 8 chips in the system, and there were 2 main processors. A lot of developers couldn't figure out the second processor, so they had to just work with one processor. The rumor I heard was originally the system was meant to be a 2D system, but when they heard the specs of the original PlayStation, they went with another processor to make it 3D. And it's a shame because this system is a very good 2D system. When it came to 3D games, kind of did very well. Now, the PlayStation came out September of 1995 in the US, and the Sega Saturn at the time was priced at $399. So you know what that meant? Sony came to E3 and said that the price So yeah, basically, it almost immediately led to the Sega Saturn's demise. I've even heard comments that apparently a guy that was working for Sega, when Sony announced that the PS1 was going to be $299, they were like, oh shit, I think we're fucked. But anyways, now there are a lot of things about the Sega Saturn you need to know. So obviously, we have 2 control ports, power and reset, the open. This, I don't know what the hell, why the hell this thing is here. It's just a stupid CD I had. It's a trend net for Wi-Fi, and I don't know why I still have it. I don't use that router anymore. But let's get into some things. One thing you might notice is that there's a cartridge input. See right here? Now, at first, some people thought that it could play Genesis games. It doesn't. This was for cartridges for the Sega Saturn to get memory, to add more memory, and to add more RAM for the graphics. Because some Sega Saturn games needed more power to run on the system. You need memory because in here, which I'm about to, hopefully I can lift this door off. Yeah, it's very annoying to get out. You see that right there? If my camera could focus, that is a battery. If that battery goes out, you lose all your save data. So that's really, really annoying. These batteries don't last long. They only last like 2 or 3 years. And then once it's dead, you're out of luck. So that's why it's important to have, cartridges for the Sega Saturn that have RAM and memory, so that way you have, memory. You don't have to deal with the battery bullshit. There is something I'm going to tell you about that in just a minute, but let's get to more accessories. By the way, this model I have here is actually the Model 1 Sega Saturn. The Model 2 has round buttons, and the Sega logo, as you see right here, the Sega logo is right there. It came with the controller, obviously. This here is the first model Sega Saturn controller, and it's not really all that good. I mean, it's kind of comfortable, feels okay. I have this in really pretty good shape, but the D-pad's a little iffy. The buttons are fine. The shoulder buttons they barely move, and the start button. It's an okay controller. It's not the best, and this is what it was launched with. And let me clean up some of the wires. But yeah, basically, I don't use this controller at all. However, the controller you want to get, and in my opinion, thank you. My camera couldn't focus. In my opinion, the greatest controller of all time, next to the 360 controller. And that's the Sega Saturn Model 2 controller. This controller is amazing. So here's the main difference between the two controllers. It's shaped like the Genesis 6-button controller, but even better. You have a very, very nice grip. Very comfortable to hold. The D-pad is amazing. The buttons feel great, and the shoulder buttons are much better. It's an amazing controller, and I highly recommend you guys getting this controller. There was also a 3D controller, which I don't own, unfortunately. I'll try to see if I can find one in the game convention. That was used for Knights in the Dreams and other games. Here is the Sega Stunner. This is used for light gun games such as Virtual Cop 1 and 2 and some of the third-party games that came out. So now, on to that one accessory that I want to talk about. I don't own one, and I'm planning to get one. The number one accessory you really want for the Sega Saturn is the Action Replay Plus. And what that cartridge does is not only does it let you have so much memory, it lets you play import games and even burn games. Because the Sega Saturn has tons and tons of great games. The problem was a lot of them didn't come to the US. And if some did come to the US, it was very, very limited. Hence why a lot of Sega Saturn games are very expensive nowadays, such as Panzer Dragoon Saga, House of the Dead. Both games are very expensive now because they came out so late into the Sega Saturn's life. I do have some games, and I'll show them off. We have Astal, which is a very good 2D platformer. Really good game. The Sega Saturn games came in these very long glass cases. I'll say that game just for a second. I recently picked this up, NBA Jam Tournament Edition, so it did have some arcade ports, and they were pretty well done. This is one game that was pretty big for the Sega Saturn, Daytona USA, which is a port of the arcade game. This version hasn't really aged all that well. It's okay, but this was a big deal back in like 95 or 96. And the last one I have here is Virtual Cop 2, which is a phenomenal light gun game. Very, very good light gun game. And I have a few more Sega Saturn games, but they're all in DVD cases. We got Fighting Vipers, which is a really fun fighting game. We've got in Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3, which is a very, very good version of the game. We've got in, of course, Virtual Cop 1, which is a really fun game. And last but not least, one of the most important games and a very, very good game for the Sega Saturn, Nights in the Dreams. And this is one of the few 3D games that the Sega Saturn did very, very well. Nights in the Dreams is a very different type of game. It's made by a Sonic team, and it's very well done. Amazing music. And last but not least, it had an amazing port of Virtual Fighter 2. I actually have this game complete, but since it was taking up too much room, I decided to put this in its little sleeve. So that's all the Sega Saturn games I have. I used to have more, but I decided to sell some of them. So, the Sega Saturn didn't last very long. It lasted around until 1998, and then Sega immediately dropped it and wanted to work with on the Dreamcast, and we all know how that turned out. I mean, the Dreamcast was an amazing system, but Sega's management also fucked up that system, just like what happened with the Sega Saturn. And also with Sega saying the Sega Saturn, it was not our future, and that also pissed off everyone. But yeah, that's pretty much the overview of the Sega Saturn. It's a very good console, but it's very expensive to collect for because a lot of the games came out so late. Now comes emulation. The Sega Saturn is a very tough system to emulate, and it took nearly 20 years until 2016 when someone finally was able to crack the system. And that system, and finally, we have now gotten almost accurate Sega Saturn emulators. It's still not too accurate, but it's enough for you to at least, play your games on the PC and all that, if you don't want to spend all that money. Or you could get the action replay and try to play burn games, and doing burn games is pretty easy on the Sega Saturn. You can do it without modding it, but it's a soft. But let me explain what that technique was. You have to first of all make sure that the Sega Saturn's open the whole time, and then do like the swap trick. I don't recommend that at all because it basically weakens the hell out of the laser lens on the Sega Saturn. But that's pretty much a review and an overview of the Sega Saturn. It's a very good game. Has great 2D games. Very good 2D games. Not so much on the 3D games. And the system ended up being a failure. It did well in Japan. It actually sold, I think, more than the N64 in Japan, but it did very, very poorly in the US. But there's a lot of good games on the Sega Saturn, like 330 Dwarfs, Clockwork Knight 1 and 2, all the games I mentioned here. Panzer Dragoon 1 and 2. Just a lot of different games you wouldn't see on the Sega on any other system. The Sega Saturn, there's also a lot of RPGs on the Sega Saturn, so that's another big plus for the system. There are tons and tons and tons of RPGs on this system. Well, that's it for my little thoughts on the Sega Saturn. Will I recommend the Sega Saturn? Yes, but make sure you have a lot of money for a Sega Saturn, because Sega Saturn nowadays are going up pretty high right now. I got mines back in 2013 for like $40, and it came with Nights in the Dream. And eventually I got the light gun along with Virtual Cop 1 and 2, and I just had fun with the Sega Saturn. It's a great system. Just some things about it that were kind of head scratchers, but yeah. Alright guys, that's it for the review. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.